Holy Gospel according to Mark.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Jesus and the disciples went on and passed through Galilee. He did not want anyone to know it, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, "The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him. And 3 days after being killed, he will rise again." But they did not understand what he was saying and were afraid to ask him. Then they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" But they were silent, for on the way they had argued with one another who was the greatest. He sat down, called the 12, and said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." Then he took a little child and put it among them. And taking it in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
St. Thomas Aquinas once said, "Fear is such a powerful emotion for humans that when it takes over, when we allow it to take over within us, it drives compassion right out of our hearts." Fear is a powerful emotion. Change, transition, uncertainty, which we face all the time, chaos, and earth-shattering news all create within us a sense of fear. So it is fitting that in today's gospel reading, we find words that help us look at this very human emotion. In today's gospel passage, Jesus continues to teach discipleship to the 12. He again gives them some pretty mind-boggling, earth-shattering news, and they are bewildered and afraid. Today we hear Jesus again tell the disciples he's going to be killed. This is the second time he tells them that he will soon be betrayed, murdered, and after 3 days rise from the dead. Jesus' words are so explosive that they just cannot get their minds around this. They cannot understand what he is saying, and they're afraid. Throughout the Gospel of Mark, the disciples are portrayed as a motley group of knuckleheads who just don't get it. And in today's reading, they truly live up to their reputation. You see, they are still thinking Jesus will be the one who will provide the Jewish people political deliverance from Rome. The prospect of Jesus being killed simply does not compute for them. This Jesus, whom they believe is the promised Messiah, is telling them that redemption of Israel will take place through suffering. Who could possibly imagine that? How could anyone believe that an all-powerful God would conquer enemies and provide deliverance through suffering and death? The disciples are bewildered, and so what do? Well, they stay silent, and they do not ask Jesus to clarify what he is saying. They do not ask Jesus to answer the many questions swirling about in their confused minds. No. Why do they not ask? Mark simply says it is because they were afraid. And we are left to wonder, why are they afraid? Do they fear they might appear to be confused? Do they fear they might appear uninformed, clueless, or stupid yet again? Do they fear they might appear unfaithful? Or do they fear they might get answers they do not want to hear and are not ready to hear? The disciples' failure to understand and ask questions seems rather annoying. But how often do we act in precisely the same manner? How often are we afraid to ask a question because we think we should already know the answer? How often are we simply afraid to show our ignorance? And in a world where we work so hard, striving to succeed, how can we possibly let ourselves appear so vulnerable? And how often are we possibly afraid of the answer we will get? Are we afraid of being a follower and living the truth of Jesus' passion? As a congregation, what are our fears as a community of faith? Do we fear the decisions we make may cause us to lose members? Or do we fail to make decisions because we fear the development of conflict? As we look at another calendar year and this week begin our annual stewardship drive, does our anxiety create a fear that we will not make the budget? Theologian David Lose, when exploring this reading, suggests all these fears strip life of pleasure and joy and make it very difficult to be wise and faithful stewards of the present moment and resources with which God has entrusted us. Jesus' response to our fears and anxieties is an invitation not to faith as intellectual assent, as if believing in God somehow prohibits fear, but rather to faith as movement, faith as taking a step forward, even a little step, in spite of doubt and fear. Faith as doing even the smallest thing in the hope and trust of God's promises. Quite frankly, fear is the opposite of faith. Fear has the power to paralyze us, to distort our thinking and drive us into despair. As we think about the disciples' fear, it is interesting to note their reaction. Rather than asking questions and facing their fears, they begin to argue. And what is even more interesting is that they are not even arguing about what Jesus said. They begin to fight about which one of them is the greatest. Again, the disciples are not much different from each one of us. How often have we seen this happen in the church, within our own communities, and even within our own families? Some incident, event, experience, or person upsets the system, and then fear raises its ugly head. People become fearful of possibly losing out in some way, and so they strive to get to the top, to attain the best position of power so that they are the ones in control. People fear there's not enough love to go around. People fear change within the system, and suddenly tempers flare and an argument ensues. And just like the disciples in today's story, the fighting has nothing to do with the real issue, but we react by arguing about something else because we cannot face our fear. When Jesus asks the disciples what they are arguing about, again, there is silence and it is deafening. And I think most of us can probably relate to such silence. Anyway, Jesus knows what they've been fighting about, so he again teaches about discipleship, saying, so you want first place? So you want to be at the top? Then take the last place. Be servant of all. And to help them understand, he places a curious, vulnerable child in their midst. Now, to understand what is really happening here, we must understand that children were thought of very differently in this ancient culture than they are in our culture. Nadia Bolz-Weber succinctly articulates the difference between the way children were regarded then as opposed to the manner in which we treat our children today. She says, these children didn't exactly take bubble baths every night before being tucked into their Sesame Street bed sheets and read Good Night Moon. There was no sentimentality about childhood because childhood was actually a time of terror. Children in those days only really had value as replacement adults, but until then they were more like mongrel dogs than they were beloved members of a family. And they weren't even really housebroken. They just kind of leaked everywhere, and they died like all the time. Children were dirty and useless and often unwanted. And to teach his disciples about greatness and hospitality, Jesus puts not a chubby-faced angel, but this kind of child in the center, folds this kind of child into his arms and says, when you welcome the likes of this child, you welcome me. In a culture where children were of no consequence, given no value, and considered socially invisible, Jesus cradles a dirty, smelly, rejected little child in his arms and says, whoever embraces one of these children as I do, embraces me, and far more than me, the God who sent me. That's quite a lesson in discipleship. Not only has Jesus hit the disciples with some earth-shattering news about his death and murder, he again turns their thinking and ours inside out and upside down. Fear has the power to blind us to what God is doing here among us as we live together in community. Fear has the power to blind us to what God is up to in this world. Fear has the power to blind us from recognizing God's kingdom at work as it is breaking in upon us at this very moment. Fear has the power to blind us from recognizing those we consider other as children of God. Fear prevents us from seeing Jesus in a different way, and that is challenging because if we see Jesus in a different way, we begin to see each other in a different way. And you can count on the fact that when Jesus breaks into our lives with overwhelming grace and unconditional love, he is always going to challenge us, challenge our assumptions, change our world, and change us as we are called to travel and move more deeply into a life of discipleship. Jesus continues to teach what real discipleship is all about by telling us that greatness in the kingdom of God means becoming a servant. And oh my, in doing so, he turns our thinking and understanding of success upside down. Discipleship means taking the last place and not being on top. It is so hard to do this because we want to be in control, and we are so fearful of letting go and letting God take control. Jesus says that discipleship, Jesus style, means welcoming the child, welcoming those who are socially invisible, welcoming those whom the rest of society excludes, and welcoming those the world does not value, those whom we tend to fear. Discipleship, Jesus style, means welcoming those who do nothing but are simply welcomed and embraced. In reality, the vulnerable, dirty child who fearlessly comes with questions is where discipleship actually begins. And the truth of the matter is, discipleship begins as we become the child on Jesus' lap. Amen.